welcome to the podcast. Mohit, thank you so much for joining. I really appreciate you taking the time to be here and responding to my request to have this discussion. So thank you so much for being here with us today. I really appreciate it.
It's a pleasure to be here, and I really look forward to the conversation.
Thank you. So why don't we, before we get into what you do, let's tell us a little bit about yourself and then how you got to this point with Ultrahuman and what you're doing now.
Sure. So my background is that I'm a serial entrepreneur. I started a company in the year 2015, which I eventually exited to an e-commerce company called Zomato. And then after that, given that I've been interested in the health and fitness space, more from an athletics perspective, myself, I started experimenting with wearables, hardware devices, biomarkers, etc., and also partnered with a bunch of doctors, sports scientists to actually figure out what is the next, what's the way in which people are going to get healthy in the next 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years from now, right? And the answer pretty much I was seeking was, how do we actually cut through the clutter that's actually out there, right? So there's so much of counterintuitive, conflicting advice out there in terms of health and fitness that people almost keep flipping between different options. So how does one actually see through this clutter? And the answer was pretty much in data. So if you can generate data about our own bodies, we can actually figure out not just what's good for like a group of people, but also pretty much good for an individual, right? So that was the prime hypothesis with which we started almost 2.5 years back. And since then, of course, approximately a few 100,000 users later, and almost you can say thousands of users using the platform on a monthly basis, I think our learnings are pretty much aligned with what the hypothesis was, that a lot of people don't actually have access to their own data enough, and basically not just access, but also interpretation of their own health data to understand what's actually happening in their body. And once somebody understands what's happening, and they start taking micro steps towards improving it. So that would be a quick 2-minute summary.
Great. Yeah, I do think there's so much misconception out there, and now with social media more than ever, it's very confusing. Something looks good, or sometimes a famous person's endorsing something that may not be the healthiest thing or healthiest choice for one individual, and it can be very confusing. So let's get into a little bit. Can you tell me more about, because I agree with you, having data, of course, the more data you have, the more you know, the better outcomes for almost anything you can get. And then interpreting that data. So why don't you tell us a little bit about how Ultrahuman works? Tell us how it works and how that can help people have better outcomes. What are the outcomes that they can achieve by using Ultrahuman? How does it work?
Absolutely. So Ultrahuman is a biowearable platform. So we use multiple biowearables to look at your biomarkers, your health biomarkers. And what we do is we actually stream those biomarkers directly from your body to a smartphone app, which basically helps you interpret the data, right? So essentially, you can look at your glucose, which is I think for us a very important biomarker, and with the new hardware that we have released recently, you can also look at your sleep patterns, your resting pattern, HRV, movement, all those factors included with or in a combination with your glucose. So our vision essentially is to help people understand multiple of these biomarkers and also interpret it, right? Because if you just look at glucose without context, it might not mean anything in many scenarios. But if you have context around why the glucose is varying in a certain way, was it because of food or lack of rest or exercise, or because all of these factors affect your glucose response, you'll be able to understand how your body reacts to all of these scenarios, physiological scenarios. So that's what we're building. In the future, of course, we want to add more and more biomarkers. Think of things like ketones, lactates, alcohol, all of these additional biomarkers to actually help you understand how your analytes of your body are trending. So, for example, with ketones, you can actually figure out, like essentially, what is your body's metabolic flexibility. So, what sort of fuel does the body actually use when the user is fasting? So, all of those are future extensions. But today, we track glucose and a few other physiological biomarkers like HRV, sleep, movement, etc.
And when you're how are people, because honestly, I've not tried your app, I've not downloaded and looked to see what people see when they use it, but how is the app educating them about their glucose? Is it showing, like, if you're, first of all, maybe I should step back a minute. What is considered, does it show a full range of blood sugar in the app, or is there like a certain high level? Are you trying to suggest to people that they target a particular blood glucose level?
Sure. So once you put on a CGM, we stream the glucose data from a CGM. What you see is essentially your continuous glucose stream. Now, based on the way the glucose stream actually moves throughout the day, we interpret the glucose stream to also give you something called a metabolic score. So the metabolic score is, in some ways, your glucose metabolism performance, right? So there are certain factors that the score actually includes. These factors are things like time within a certain target range, your glucose variability, and your average glucose, right? Apart from many other factors. We also include certain factors like, for example, when your glucose is rising, what is the acceleration rate and deceleration rate when it's falling. So what happens is that this score acts like a meta score to help you understand your glucose metabolism performance. And what you need to do as a user is essentially that you do things that actually help you improve this metabolic score. Now, you could, by the way, optimize your meals to improve this metabolic score. You can essentially do strength training, which makes you more insulin sensitive, to optimize this metabolic score. You can also optimize your sleep, which will also improve your insulin sensitivity to help you optimize this metabolic score. So sort of works like a compass for your health, right? Now, there are two types of use cases that we have seen till now. One is people put the CGM on and they start getting a metabolic score and they go by their life like usual, right? And they make minor lifestyle changes. Like, for example, they would walk after their meals. They would do like exercise 2 to 3 times per week minimum. They would sort of like make their meals more balanced. These are all the suggestions that the platform will give you along the way. Once you do some of these things, your scores will be on the higher side naturally. You don't need to input anything to actually get a score, right? You don't need to input anything like a food log or a workout score, etc., to actually get a score. You'll get a metabolic score by default. That's one type of use case. The other type is that people who are like certainly more curious, they actually want to go deeper into their health. What they would do is they would log all of these events as well. They would say that at this point in time, I ate XYZ, so this is my glucose response. At 4 p.m., I did a strength training workout. This is my glucose response. So if you give us more information, of course, we can help you understand more about your life. So for example, if you tell us what sort of workout did you do, we can tell you how would you have actually improved your workout performance as well. Because glucose is a zone 3 fuel. So zone 3 workout fuel. So all those are, you can say, integrations as well as capabilities of the platform that are built. But at the very basic, you put on a CGM, you get a score. You will be given nudges from the platform to improve the score. And as you improve the score, you get metabolically healthier.
Is there a target blood sugar? And when you talk about the range, because time and range is critical for people with diabetes, particularly type 1. And that range is very different than a person without diabetes. So do you have a target glucose level that people are going for, or is your because assuming that you are supporting people without diabetes, is your range shorter, smaller than other, what someone with diabetes might need?
Absolutely. So we deal with a very different range. This is the 70 to 110 range, as we see on the platform. So it doesn't mean that people can't reach or breach this range as well. It's perfectly fine to breach this range of 110, or also to actually be below 70, right? That's not what we mean by the range being there on the platform. But what's interesting is that the amount of times that people breach this range, the amount of time that people spend outside this range, all of these factors have a role to play in your metabolic health. So it's not just about one time breach or two times breaching, but how many times a week, how many times a month, what is the amplitude of your breach, essentially, right? So all of these factors actually play a much larger role. That's why it's a thin, narrow band where we define this band as optimal glucose range for non-diabetic, non-metabolically disordered people. That's, yeah. The way to understand this range, you can say from a research perspective in this space, is that there are two types of research paradigms that you will see in the metabolic health space. One is you look at diabetic people and you look at or you look at pre-diabetic and diabetic people, in fact, and you look at where exactly does the vascular damage start happening, right? At what ranges? And generally, if you look at American Diabetes Association and everybody else, the breach range is defined as 140, right? So 140 to 150 is sort of like the range. Above that, spending a lot of time is actually unhealthy. And it also depends a lot on doctor and the diagnosis, and basically in certain geographies, there's a different standard. Like for example, in India, in certain segments in India, there's this culture that even 160 is okay, right? But that's on the diabetic side. What we've seen is that, in fact, in non-diabetic people, right, when you study non-diabetic people specifically, and non-metabolically disordered people who have appreciable levels of insulin sensitivity, there what we have seen is that vascular damage starts happening even as early as reach of 110. And this in combination with glucose variability and average glucose being lifted, sort of like you can say accentuates this factor. So it's not that you just reach 110 once and vascular damage will start happening, but then if your glucose variability is also high and the average glucose also stays high over a certain point, then of course your health will suffer a little bit, right? So that's why it's sort of like a aggregated score. So instead of just looking at number of spikes and number of amount of time you're spending above a certain range, what we've done is we have actually incorporate all of these factors into one algorithm, which basically sort of like helps you understand that one spike is okay because your score won't reduce by that much. One out of range is actually okay. But then if you do it multiple times a day, multiple times a week, multiple times a month, and have taller spikes, it's actually pretty bad.
Does your app have, like, for example, let's say if I registered and put my information in the app, and let's say I had type 2 diabetes, and first, I guess what I'm trying to say, is it possible to tell the app that I have type 2 diabetes or type 1 diabetes, and would it adjust the range, or will it look at my markers differently and score me in a different way?
So as of now, we are actually focused on the non-diabetic population. Because I think with diabetes, and specifically with the scenario of medication, the glucose patterns become harder to interpret, given the fact that the reduction in glucose or the increase in glucose could be because of factors that are non-lifestyle, right? And just to recap, we are a lifestyle optimization platform, right? So the focus would be to influence improvement of your glucose metabolism through your lifestyle. So if medication comes into picture, it's a little bit more complicated. So we haven't yet built an intervention for people who are on medication, but it does not mean that in the future we might not. So people who are diabetic who are not under medication might actually still find value. people who are diabetic and are undergoing medication, I think the recommendation is that the platform in fact asks you a question that if you're diabetic, please don't use the platform. And even if you're non-diabetic, you should use this platform in combination with your physician or your medical professional that you're in touch with. So I think it's important that people understand that this is an important biomarker to optimize. At the same time, this is a critical biomarker, right? So we cannot misinterpret this biomarker in any way, right? So we should not misinterpret this as well.
Yeah, that's really good to highlight, because I mean, as we talked earlier, people see something on social media and they think, oh, wow, this is really great and this can help me, but unknowingly or naively, and then they might have diabetes and, don't take it so seriously. And then suddenly they're using something that may not be good for them, or that they don't understand, I guess, how to use sometimes if they don't have oversight by a doctor. If, let's say I don't have diabetes, but I start using the app, and then my blood sugar is quite high and can't seem to get it down, is there a way that you could notify people that then maybe they need some medical intervention?
Yeah, so one is the medical intervention, which our support team and performance coaches on the platform will reach out to you and tell you that if you might actually want to. There are two options. In fact, one is reach out to a medical professional or actually calibrate your range. Sometimes there is a calibration challenge as well on the platform because your baseline might not have been adjusted really well. We've seen both the scenarios. But in these scenarios, we do facilitate reach out from the internal team so that people are actually aware about what's actually happening in the body. It should not be a surprise. And it should not certainly be a shock after a few months of usage.
Does your app, or anywhere, I guess it could be anywhere else, but within the app, does it have do you educate people about metabolic health? Not just showing your upper or lower limit, but I mean, some apps do that in the form of videos or, different things like this, and explaining to them. Like earlier, you gave the example of maybe a strength workout, improving the score. But if you do a strength workout, typically your blood sugar is going to go up.
Yeah.
So do you explain why? Because some people, they'll put a CGM on and maybe they have like a pre-diabetes diagnosis or something. And then they think they're doing good by exercising, and then they go exercise and their blood sugar will go up. Yeah. And then they're scared to exercise.
Yeah. Absolutely. So it's in both scenarios. One is in line with the usage of the platform, we actually send you both corrective nudges, but also nudges on the basis of learning. So if you log a workout that essentially gives you a spike, the platform will tell you that this spike was actually pretty okay because it was a gluconeogenesis spike. So that is training in line with your events and your activity in the day. We also create our own videos and our own you can say audio podcasts and stuff ourselves, blogs and videos and podcasts. The videos are interesting because they are 3 to 5 minute videos. So you could just in context to where your score is, you would be suggested a specific type of video as well on the basis of what day you are at. Like essentially if you're on the first day or the 15th day or let's say the 30th day, which one is the most relevant video that you should be seeing. We sort of create these animated videos to help people understand what is the core mechanism through which this is happening. Why is the glucose moving in a certain way? A lot of users who actually use the platform tell us that the platform is very, very educational in nature. So we educate people on insulin sensitivity and specifically the phenomenon of insulin resistance and why does it happen, what are the downstream effects of insulin resistance. And it's not just diabetes, right? It's also other metabolic disorders that are at the downstream of reduced insulin sensitivity. So I think that's been a mega focus for us because we also attract a lot of, you can say, self-motivated people who are motivated to take control of their own health in their own hands. And essentially, they need it. They can't be convinced just by saying that, hey, here's a pill, you take it and your health will improve. These people are highly informed. They have questions. and they're coming here because they've probably tried like many things in the past, but they found it to be non-scientific or non-logical, and then essentially switched to something that is more objective and more scientific. So I think it's an important part of the platform.
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. So before this podcast airs, so I've done 2 other discussions about this topic, because I think it's really, important to get the medical community input as well. Because we're always saying at Diapoint, we're not a clinic, and the only medical advice we give is get medical advice. There's, always a lot of general things we can talk about, but they need to go back and always ask their doctor what they're doing. Because I meet so many people that have had, maybe, metabolic issues, not just diabetes, maybe thyroid issues and other things. And maybe they felt like they got bad medical advice, but then they're like, oh, but I cured myself. And I'm like, well, how do you know? And they don't have any data. And I'm not suggesting that you ignore your doctor and get an app and solve it yourself, but because that can be quite dangerous. But all the doctors that I've talked to, the endocrinologists, and these are endocrinologists that see people with type 2 diabetes, type 1 diabetes, and I asked them what their thoughts were, and they said it wasn't a terrible idea for people without diabetes to do it, because the more data you have, as you're pointing out, then the more you can understand your health. Maybe it's not something we want to or need to do over the long term for everyone, but they didn't, they weren't against it. They said, it would help. And I'm not so sure. I mean, I consider myself pretty healthy. I exercise, I've trained for a marathon, but I'm not so competitive that I personally feel the need to do it. Would I be curious? I don't know, maybe, but maybe I'm not, because my son has type 1 and he has a CGM, and I see enough CGM data all the time that I don't think about it in that way. But certainly I think what you pointed out is that it can be helpful and highlight some habits or some things to people that would hopefully get them to go to their doctor and ask questions. The one question that I wanted to ask you, and I think a lot of people in the diabetes community have. So when your app first came to my attention, someone shared it, and here in Dubai we have there's a group of moms, and we all have children with type 1 diabetes, and someone highlighted there's a particular popular person, influencer type person, and he had on one of his social media videos, he's like, oh, I'm using this, let me check my blood sugar and see. And I was aware of the use of glucose monitoring for people without diabetes. I've seen and heard about a few other applications before, but I never really explored it. And it was interesting because I thought, okay, of course, if you have a company and you want it to be seen, you want it to be known, and it's very normal to, have someone use it. But the reaction was mixed. Like, one person said, oh, well, this is great because maybe now it will be more acceptable that our kids have this condition and they're wearing this device. But then others, and it just so happened, I wasn't seeking out this information, but adults with type 1, who are maybe some strong advocates, some of them have blogs and write articles and other things, they were very much against it. And I think I don't have diabetes, so I shouldn't maybe even speak on their behalf, but I think it's because people with type 1 don't have a choice. Sometimes people with type 2 don't have choices either. Metabolic things can happen. We can't control it, but nobody has a choice in type 1. There's no prediction for type 1. You will die in a matter of days without insulin, and you have to wear this device all the freaking time. And it reminds you that you have this condition and it's really hard. So they were feeling that why, or it's not right. It's not, something that the general public doesn't need because their pancreas works. So what would your response to those critics be?
Just to understand this a little bit more, is the concern that general people should not wear because their pancreas works is the understanding, or is the reason that that this technology is highly critical for type 1 diabetics, so they should only be reserved for type 1 diabetics?
It could perhaps be both, because I can't speak on their behalf. I think a lot of it has to do with like, hey, your pancreas is working, so don't, why? And then maybe there's also the question of, is it going to help the research and finding cure for type 1, or is it going to be that CGMs are now so acceptable and so cool that it undermines that search to solve the issue of type 1? So I think probably both questions that you ask, I think there's probably people that have both of those feelings, or one or the other. So it could be both.
Absolutely. I've certainly heard both of these concerns. First of all, to address this, I think clearly pancreas is not like a switch. So your insulin sensitivity or your body's ability to, in case of type 1, its body is unable to produce enough insulin. In case of type 2, there is the scenario of insulin resistance or reduced insulin sensitivity. In both the scenarios, the delivery of glucose to the body in the right way is actually not happening, or the disposal of glucose in some cases is not happening, right? So it's sort of like an insulin dysfunction, to be honest. Now, this is quite a paradox, because first of all, pancreas is not like a switch. It's not like on one day it works and on the other day it stops working. So there is degradation that happens over time. And this degradation happens in type 2 and in other metabolic disorders because of lifestyle changes or lifestyle disorders, right? So usually, how do you actually...
There's a small percentage that's genetic. Often, of course, we could eliminate so much type 2 and pre-diabetes and insulin resistance if people made lifestyle changes. I don't deny that, but there is a small percent.
Absolutely. We're talking about 82% of people who actually have a type 2 scenario because of a metabolic disorder that is more lifestyle-led, right? So in those people, these changes are happening because of their lifestyle, because of poor food choices sometimes, stressful lifestyles, lack of activity, lack of sleep, etc., right? And if those people end up choosing to measure their health after the problem has occurred, now, based on last 30 years of research, we know that the diabetic remission rate is 92%. Once somebody is diabetic, even if they change their lifestyle, their probability of going back to becoming a diabetic is actually close to 92%. This is in the United States. So it's very hard to actually become a non-diabetic again, right? So
for type 2, I know I hate this thing about reverse diabetes, because you might change your lifestyle for the short term and think it's okay, and then you can go back to doing what you were doing. And in the US, I believe it's very hard with all the processed foods and everything else that's happening in the food industry. Extremely hard and extremely expensive as well. It's cheaper to eat processed junk food. I think that's a super important point that you just made, not related to any technology, but I think people should be aware of that.
Absolutely. I think the point here is that unless people track the progress of their health, like if I had slightly better insulin sensitivity or glucose disposal capabilities last year, and I've degraded for the last 1 year, I'm not diabetic yet. But if that has happened, I should actually reverse this change before even becoming diabetic. Now, for me to reverse and change this means that I should probably go to workout or basically balance my meals. It's a very small change in my lifestyle, right? And my stickability is much higher versus somebody who's already diabetic and realizes this almost always too late, right? So that's why it's important. Why we feel it's important to see data early is because you can prevent the problem from happening, right? It's as simple as that. You can prevent the problem from happening. And there is evidence around not just the prevention side of things, which is more mathematical in nature, because if you know data ahead of the problem occurring, you can obviously action much faster, and you'll have more leverage with the problem. But also around glucose variability, which basically is the reason for oxidative stress, or is a marker of oxidative stress. And even in so-called metabolically healthy people, glucose variability is a problem. Now we have advanced evidence around that, right? So for them to track glucose variability, any which ways is important, right? So those are the two reasons scientifically why this is important, we feel. The other reason is like concerning the concern of these devices being, you can say, limited in nature, and devices being expensive, and devices being used by everyone else and not being as available to type 1 diabetics. I strongly feel that this is a big problem. I truly resonate with the type 1 community here, because the fact that CGMs have enormous capability to actually improve the lives of type 1 diabetics in the world. In the US, I think the statistics that I was reading is that less than 4% type 1 diabetics actually have access to a CGM.
Mm-hmm.
After
That's
20
probably
years
true. A lot of people can't afford it. And I mean, in the US, they're available, but their insurance just doesn't cover wearables. Like here, same issue. My son's CGM is not covered, and it's expensive. It's extremely expensive. And if you don't have a job where you have a salary that you can afford it, then it's really challenging. And then there's other countries where it's the choice between feeding your family or a month's salary and buying one. Sometimes even it's quite expensive. But yes,
it's actually weird, because type 1 is not a choice in many cases, right?
In all cases, not many. In all cases, type 1 is not a choice.
To be honest. Let me correct that. It's not a choice. And this is a forced down condition, that why should CGMs be actually so expensive, right? It is not the right thing for the world, right? And I think what we believe is that the only way out here is to make CGMs extremely cheap, right? Extremely accessible. And only then, I mean, it's straightforward, right? I mean, if CGMs tomorrow become 1/10 the price of what they are today, it would certainly improve the quality of life of millions of type 1 people out there, right? As straightforward as that. Like, there are other things to do as well, but then this is the most important thing to do. Now, what is the path to making it cheaper? The path to making any hardware, device, electronics cheaper, right, is essentially to scale it. I mean, there is, if you apply the laws of efficiency, laws of replicability, etc., the only way to make it available in a mass way is to actually make it available to everyone else. So think like it should be made available to millions and millions of people. Only then you will be able to achieve the economies of scale. If you keep it pristine and like only available to 10 million people or 20 million people globally, then obviously the companies building this product are going to upmark this, make this available only at a premium and only available to a small population. And I certainly feel that that's a huge problem in this space today. One, glucose is an important biomarker. Your frequency of usage does not need to be like 26 times per year or 25 times per year, like basically as frequent as the type 1 scenario, but it should be a few times per year to understand how your glucose is trending. And B, this technology should be made available to people. And to make it available, somebody has to actually scale this technology, make it available at 10x reduced cost, 1/10 the cost actually, right? And I think that I'm actually in support of what the type 1 community is actually saying, inherent that if this is highly available to us, right, then this solves a lot of our quality of life problem, and which is what we are also committed to as a mission, not directly but indirectly for sure, which is if millions and millions of CGMs are available tomorrow, and there'll be companies that would actually find economies of scale here in manufacturing these CGMs at millions and millions of user scale. All these devices are going to be made available at 1/10 the cost that it is at right now. This happened across all, like the first smartphone was like compared to the cost of that smartphone versus smartphones today, same features basically, right? Like essentially the bill of materials essentially reduces significantly over time. So I think that's the second large point around why this should be made available and scaled as a category, rather than thinking about, yes, should governments make it cheaper? Absolutely. But then the problem with the government loop is that it takes a lot of time and it will not happen in a global way. It'll only happen in certain geographies where the insurance is, we know with years and years of insurance data, is that having expensive healthcare and quality of healthcare might not necessarily be the same thing. Your expenses will actually rise higher than the quality of healthcare available, right? So
Right.
government is going to pass on the stress to the citizens in terms of saying that if something is expensive and needs to be made available for free, or let's say for very, very minimal cost, the stress will be there somewhere, right? Instead, if we make the technology cheaper, then I think every government in the world would be keen to improve the quality of life for people around. Those would be my 2 points, I would say.
No, thank you for that. And I would hope that's the case. I think, some people with type 1 would say also they hope so as well. But if you're, using the US as an example, if you look at the cost of insulin, that's kind of needed on a larger scale, and it's still not affordable for everyone. In some countries, yes, in other countries, no. But yeah, I do hope that, laws that should be natural economic laws would hopefully apply to this, and make it accessible for everyone. It would be wonderful. What I've said, and perhaps maybe you looked into it, but what I've said to, on the previous 2 podcasts is, I don't know if you know, there's a brand of shoes called Todd's. And I believe it was started by an American. And when he was traveling, he visited a place where he saw people who had no shoes. So he was inspired he started making shoes. It's like this kind of moccasin type shoe. And he would, his thing was for every pair of shoes that he sold, he would donate 1 pair of shoes to someone in need. Just putting that out there. So, and of course it depends on business models. It depends on, I don't know what CGM you're using, but also at what cost you get them. But that would be probably a dream for so many people if there's companies out there that could make that part of their business. And it doesn't have to be your company. It can be even the device companies that are marketing to people with diabetes. For everyone that's sold, donate one, to someone in need. Now the challenge is, making it sustainable, that you keep needing to wear the CGM, but there's some, and this isn't, Ultrahuman's issue to solve, but there's some countries out there, even they don't, for people with type 1 or any type of diabetes, they're able to test their blood sugar once a week, twice a month.
Yeah,
because they don't have access, and they have to go hours to a pharmacy and physically do it. And so they're living with the condition really blindly. So there's definitely something broken in some of the systems that needs to be fixed. But of course, we would hope that everyone could have access to this technology. So I appreciate the way that you see it, and the way that you're also supporting people to prevent, as a prevention measure. I think that's really, really great.
I would to add a little bit to that. I would say that I think in this space, all of us really have to play to our strengths, to be honest, right? So the strength here is for, let's say, diabetes management companies, is to actually think about how they think about their margins and margin expansion in this case. So if they're able to make technology cheaper tomorrow, should you expand your margin or should you pass it on to people? That's another option to consider. The role that we have is to actually make technology cheaper. And in making technology cheaper, we find that we have the most leverage because we manufacture our own hardware as well. And we have the design capabilities, the manufacturing capabilities. We have the ability to understand how the architecture of our hardware works. In this case, our role is really to push the man forward in terms of like ensuring that newer hardware companies in the CGM space emerge, and we have a form factor and a hardware that's towards the direction of being 10x cheaper. And it might just be, it will be probably the same margin or lower margin for us, but it's just much higher scale. Like even from a business perspective, it's a phenomenally positive decision, right? Because we will obviously have scale when the hardware is cheaper. It will be much more accessible. So in our case, the business and the social goal is actually quite aligned, to be honest. Like if you make it available for millions of people, I think obviously from a business perspective, it is also great. But I think the point with which we want to solve this is to solve the technology problems, like make the filament significantly cheaper, significantly more accessible, and the technology around it.
Yeah, that would be amazing. So looking ahead going forward, so now that you're in the UAE, what are your plans for the future?
So the UAE market is actually a really interesting market for us. Few reasons. One is that metabolic disorders are pretty much on the rise at an accelerated rate in the UAE market, right? Because of multiple factors. In some cases, the lifestyle. I think there is one hypothesis around the food systems being completely ketogenic to now being very much processed food. And there's this food shock that the body has, that the people have seen in the region for the last 40, 50 years, right? So that like this region never had so much of sugar availability directly, right? Versus tropical climate. So I think there's you can say there's a geographical reason why this is a place where metabolic disorders are happening right now. I think the other reason is that the proximity to India in our case. So I think we see this India UAE region as one homogeneous region, and of course the GCC region as well. And I think the reason why there is homogeneity is because we are able to test on the basis of population what are some of these patterns, health patterns that we're seeing on similar type of lifestyle, similar type of food types, etc., right? Yes, there are a lot of variations as well. Like for example, between UAE and the Saudi region, you will find a lot of variations in terms of the food types. But then you'll also find a lot of similarities. So what we are interested in doing is to actually build depth in this region to really understand what are these interventions for the local population that would actually help them improve their condition of metabolic disorders. It might include lifestyle changes. It might include things around let's say fixing the food systems to some extent, looking at what sort of food gets consumed and how do we actually help. In fact, companies in the food space understand their responsibility that like us basically giving people access to cheap sugar, dopamine, etc. Beyond a certain point is not really helpful. And I think the last opportunity for us in this region is to actually create like you can say a home brand plus home technology, which basically gives access to people to technology that's actually made in UAE, right? I think that's important because if you remember during pandemic, there was a massive shortage of oxygen concentrators and oxygen cylinders throughout the world, and UAE was also one of the regions where this shortage was like pretty much visible, right, across and also across other parts of the world. Medical devices are interesting because we have, you can say, some geographical dependencies on each other, right? So there are certain CGMs that actually you buy from the European market. If because of shortages and because of inability to scale supply chain, tomorrow there are not enough CGMs in the UAE region. The problem is that it's critical hardware for a lot of people, like for example, for Diapoint diabetics, for sure, right? And I think what we want to do is we want to become like a local supply center, local manufacturing center, so that we, just like food security, you should have medical security, right? So that's why the UAE region is actually pretty interesting for us. We want to provide medical security from a CGM perspective. We want to ensure that we implement local nuances of how people can actually improve their health given their food environment. And obviously, we see that this is an area where, this is a region where we can actually help a lot of people.
Yeah, great. Yeah, and I think on like medical security and food security, when the pandemic was happening, the government was very quick to issue a statement, say, don't worry, there will be no shortages. And there were no shortages. We didn't feel it. I mean, yes, everyone that was treating COVID in hospitals and different things, there were challenges, but they were very quick, very on top of it, created all these new task force, and just the pandemic was handled so well. You didn't see people would go to the supermarket and you didn't see people like hoarding toilet paper like they were in the US. We had toilet paper on the shelves.
Yeah.
There was not a shortage of medication or anything like that. So I think it's really great. I mean, and they're proactive in that approach, I would say. So that's probably a good discussion to have. Diabetes, as you probably know from your research, there's a large genetic component in the GCC, but we also know that lifestyle changes can sometimes turn that around or help you better manage it. So it should be very interesting. I really thank you so much for your time and letting us explore the provocativeness of CGMs for people with diabetes and people without diabetes, and how your app works and how it supports people in their health and wellness and getting more data and learning more about their health. So I just want to really thank you for taking your time to help us learn more about it.
Absolutely. I had a good time here, and I think this is a space that requires a lot of detailed conversation, because I think this is the space that will actually evolve massively over the next few years as more and more people take control of their own health. So thank you for giving us a forum to discuss this, and really appreciate you taking time as well.
Thank you. Have a great day.
All right. You too. Thank you.